Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor. And before we get to our episode today, please like, share, comment, subscribe, join our Discord. And uh, I am honored to have back with me Joseph Pearce, the author of Further Up and Further In, Understanding Narnia. We are here to understand Narnia as well. So thank you for joining me, Joseph Pearce.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So if people want to know more about Joseph Pearce and find more of his work, please go to jpearce.co. That is his personal website. It will be linked in the description as well. So so we're going to be talking about, in chronological order, the third Chronicles of Narnia, The Horse and His Boy. So I think one of the times we spoke last, we talked about how Horse and His Boy is my favorite Narnia book. It hasn't been your favorite book, am I right, Joseph?
No, if you'd asked me the question about 10 years ago, I'd probably have said it's my least favorite of the Narnia books. But I've adjusted my opinion, and I actually think much more of it now than I did then. Well, I never disliked it because I just love Narnia. So that wasn't a question of disliking. It's just that I thought it was a little bit uh, off topic, so to speak. But that is actually one of the reasons I like it now, and for other reasons, I just think it's a marvelous tale.
Yeah, that's awesome. So it is really kind of like, sort of, as you say, it seems like off topic, very much so. So what was the sort of uh what was your first experience reading The Horse and His Boy like?
Well, I didn't read the Chronicles of Narnia until I was a grown up, so to speak, until I was an adult. In fact, I think it was probably after my conversion. So I would have been in my late 20s or even possibly around 30 years old when I first read it. So I came at the stories as an adult. And I think, if I remember correctly, I read all of them basically together. And, I had a box set, which I think I still own. I'm looking at it. It might not be the same one though, so I might be confusing myself. So I read them all together. I was enthralled by it and sort of engrossed by it, and sort of very aware that there was a great deal of grown-up stuff going on in the so-called children's story, especially in terms of theology, but obviously in terms of history and other things as well.
Yeah. This one can be dark at certain points, much more, I think, than many of the other books. And do
I
you
think
think
that's
that
right. I think that yeah. I mean, obviously there are aspects of darkness in Prince Caspian, other aspects of darkness, especially in the last battle. And in fact, in all of them, I mean, Lewis deals with reality, which means he deals with evil, as well as obviously with virtue and goodness and God. So there's always the dark side, the satanic side, and certainly, yeah, you're right. That's certainly a relatively large aspect of the Horse and His Boy.
Yeah, and especially just because we're dealing with sort of this pagan culture that the story is centered around in Calormen. So our main character is Shasta, as well as you could. Would you say he is the main character, or sort of is Bree also part of that main character? Are they kind of
Um,
together in that?
Well, I think Shasta and Brienne Aravis, I think they all have obviously crucial roles to play in the story. It's multi-dimensional in the sense that it's not just a single protagonist.
Hmm.
Up to a point, you could see that a story such as The Hobbit, for instance, you could certainly see that it's about Bilbo Baggins primarily, although there are other characters involved. Right, it's his journey, but I think that that there are two horses and two humans involved in that particular journey. So we need to see it as really a group of four in some sense.
Good. Yeah. No. We start with Shasta and Bree in basically they're both slaves in different ways in Calormen, and then and I don't remember if Gwyn is Gwyn a the other Aravis's horse, or the horse that
Yes.
comes with Aravis, is she also a slave, or is she? I mean, in some sense, she is, but I can't remember.
She's not a war horse, is she?
Yeah.
But insofar as she is owned, she's a slave because they both obviously originate in Narnia. They don't originate in Calaman. So they are, again, very similar with the story with Shasta. They are actually refugees. They're living in exile, although they don't know it at the beginning of the story, or at least they don't all know it at the beginning of the story. So there's an element of homecoming for all of them, and I think in two ways: a geographical, physical way. They're literally going home to the place where they are from, but also there's what is home. The actual, so in other words, the question is asked, and it's discovering what home is in a deeper sense, which is ultimately, of course, being in union with Aslan.
Yeah. It's definitely a homecoming, and it's a beautiful homecoming. That's why one of the reasons why I really love it. I love a good story where the main character doesn't know, sort of his purpose, doesn't know that he has a greater purpose, and all of these characters such have a greater purpose, within them that they don't know about, and they're both all four of them are trying to figure that out. Some sort of know it more instinctually, I would say. I think the horses, because they have been to Narnia previously, they're from Narnia. They sort of know it much more obviously because they're talking horses. And Shasta kind of knows it because he's different from everyone else in Calorman. And but Aravis, I think, doesn't see that as clearly because she
No, she's
is
on,
just
she's on
speaking.
a different sort of voyage of discovery. But I think what's good about it. I mean, one of the many things good about it that's interesting and intriguing about it. It's almost a non-quest. I won't say an anti-quest because there obviously ultimately is a quest, but they don't know it.
Hmm.
But it's a non-quest in the sense that a quest is normally leaving home in pursuit of a goal. So you have to leave your comfort zone. You have to go out into a dangerous and perilous terrain in order to achieve the quest, in order to achieve the goal, the purpose. Here, they are sort of escaping from somewhere, not really knowing what the purpose is, at least not at first. And the quest, which is ultimately self knowledge, is not something they choose, but something which is chosen for them by Aslan. And so the sort of quest sort of materializes bit by bit as the story unfolds. So it's the opposite of really. We have to get from A to B in order to achieve C. On the contrary, we just have to get out of here to anywhere. We don't really know why. That's really how it starts, and then the reason and the providential aspect, the reason for it all, becomes apparent as the story unfolds.
Yeah. Do you think it's very symbolic of vocations sort of falling into what your purpose is in life, what your main focus should be in life?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that being open to a calling, right? Because that again, a lot of it is at first not being sure of what one's supposed to be doing, and then it's the question is your own willfulness obstructing what you're being called to do, and if so, you need to learn to get out of the way. In other words, to be selfless, to actually to embrace the unknown and to do what you should, even if it's not necessarily what you would like to do at that particular moment. So I do think there's an aspect of vocation, of calling in it, and I think that's a great question.
Yeah. The It's really interesting to me that this fisherman takes Shasta in the prior to the beginning of the book. He's already taken in, and he's basically used as a slave, but Shasta thinks he's his father. Is that sort of symbolic of our understanding of maybe an abusive father or an illegitimate father, or just kind of this like sort of a society without God, where we don't know God the Father?
Well, certainly, Shasta, right at the beginning of the story, discovers, of course, that the fisherman is not his father, that he's fatherless. And the person who's not his father has obviously had treated him abusively. So there's certainly an aspect of, how should we put this, an aspect of discordance, of a lack of societal harmony, what we might call in Catholic social teaching terms solidarity. That basically with that people are just using and abusing other people for their own selfish purposes, and the consequence of that, of course, is that life is fairly miserable for most people.
Yeah, it just seems very much like sort of our society as a whole, where it's not really about, there's not true love. There's no, it's not selflessness. It is incredibly selfish.
Yeah, it's basically using others for our own purposes, for our own selfish purposes. And when you use someone for selfish purposes, you are ipso facto, by definition, abusing them. So we actually live in a society which endorses abuse of each other. So the most obvious example, of course, is the killing of children. But that we don't think, for instance, that if we have an absolute right to do what we want with our bodies and everything else, the consequences are not just unwanted pregnancies that are terminated, but children who are in single parent relationships, and then the parent has multiple other sexual relationships. And apart from any psychological harm that does to the children, there increases the likelihood of physical and sexual abuse. Because if you've got all sorts of strangers coming into the children's world, so the weakest are the ones who are basically put their backs to the wall, where we allow empowerment for the strong. And that's basically, for all this talk about rights, it's empowering the strong to abuse the weak, and the weakest are those with no voice, and that's the children.
Yeah.
And that's, in that sense, that's exactly where Shasta is at the beginning of the story. He's voiceless, he's powerless, he's friendless, and there doesn't seem to be any way out of the situation in which he finds himself.
Yeah. And Christ in the form of Aslan is coming into this world to make it right, lead Shasta, Bree, Hwyn, and Erebus out of that abusive society.
And he does so, of course, in various ways, including fear. We live in a society now where people don't think that we should fear God. But as Lewis insists on telling us, that Aslan is not a tame lion. And certainly in The Horse and His Boy, we see Aslan as very much not a tame lion. There's a point at which he's a cat, but even when he's a cat, in the graveyard on the edge of the desert, he's not a tame cat. He's looks a bit larger than we first comfortable. And of course, then at one point they're being chased by Aslan and for their lives, and all he's doing is getting them to move faster for their own sake. But that's not how they see it at the time. They're fleeing him for their lives, so they think, which he's actually making them flee faster for their own lives. He's actually saving their lives, even when they're in fear of it from him. So that Aslan being a fearful god, one that we should fear, but we should fear, but in a way that we would fear, the way that we should fear the law. That if we are going to break the law, we should be scared of the consequences of doing so. Why should the ultimate lawgiver is God? And if God gives us commandments, and we break those commandments, we should not feel that we could do it and not have any consequences attached to those. So there should be a healthy fear of the Lord. And that's what it's all over Scripture, and it's something which comes out of this particular Narnia story.
Yeah. It does seem like there's a disconnect. People think that good cannot have good and fear. You can't, that those don't work together. But but really, the reason you fear something is because they're strong, because they have the potential to be dangerous to you, but that doesn't mean that they are, going to they doesn't mean they're going to harm you. I think Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this. He talks about being dangerous. Some men need to be dangerous, and that's just because they need to be able to do. They need to be able to protect those whom they love from evil.
Absolutely, and I mean, and the point is that God, I mean, Aslan in The Horse and His Boy does punish. And I mean physically. Aravis receives a wound, which is commensurate to the wounds that she caused the slave to have because of her own selfish actions back in Calamon. So, in other words, that sin has painful consequences. Suffering is part of the way that God brings us to Him. I mean, I love the line from Oscar Wilde's poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol. But God's eternal laws are kind and break the heart of stone. For how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in? Right. So basically, if our hearts are hardened by sin, by selfishness, by pride, then it's in our best interest to have our hearts broken. So an element of suffering is necessary for our spiritual growth and for our union or reunion with God. And that's exactly what we see, that the Aslan does actually inflict suffering in The Horse and His Boy, but it's for the good of those whom he loves.
Word from our affiliate, Bishop Sheen Rosaries. You've probably worn through the chain of your cheap plastic rosary. Other rosaries simply can't stand up to the wear and tear of everyday life. Bishop Sheen rosaries are made of solid metal beads and paracord to withstand any condition, and are backed with a lifetime warranty. Upgrade your rosary to a Bishop Sheen rosary made to fit your lifestyle, or buy one for a friend. Each rosary sold supplies 2 weeks of food for a school kid in Uganda. You use the exclusive link down below to help support our efforts here at Plotlines. The link will take you to sheenrosaries.com. Be sure to use the code Plotlines10. Yeah. I mean, let's think about just Aslan's great sort of plan in the story, from sort of beginning to end. He and this starts in sort of in flashbacks, sort of, or not flashbacks, but we hear the story of how Shasta was born, in Archenland, and then it was prophesied that he would save his people, and then he is kidnapped by an evil advisor who is working with Calorman, and then basically ends up getting chased, or they go on a boat chase, and then the boats collide, and there's a battle, and then then Shasta is put in a boat with another man, with one of the servants of the people who betrayed his father, and then this man basically gives the remaining food to keep Shasta alive, and that brings him to the fisherman. The fisherman takes him in, and then Aslan is constantly working to the saving of Archenland and sort of peace, through eventually uh, basically alerting the Archenlanders to a Calorman invasion, and then giving out justice to Rabidash, making him basically a donkey who can't leave his temple, so he can't start any wars. Isn't that just so beautiful?
Yeah, it's beautiful and very profound, because what you have to realize is that Aslan's not trying to save Shasta. because Shasta is already saved, in the sense that the prophecy, if the prophecy is true, and clearly as the plot of the story shows it is, then Aslan knows exactly how things are going to work out. So it's part of the best laid schemes, or worst laid schemes, or malicious laid schemes of the evil powers, who try to cheat the will of God by removing the prophet, who, if the prophet's not killed or removed, he can't obviously deliver the people. But God does, in The Horse and His Boy, write straight with crooked lines. That for all the best laid schemes of the evil ones, they actually are unknowingly and unwittingly playing into the hands of providential design. And that's why everything plays out exactly as Aslan foretold. There's some parallels here. I mean, in the Silmarillion by Tolkien, that God says to Melkor, Satan, that there's nothing, that Melkor brings discord and into the great music of creation. His own malicious will brings sort of some sort of ugliness into the beautiful music of God. But God then says that Melkor has to understand, that Satan has to understand, that there's no theme, however dark, that Melkor can introduce into the great music, that God will not weave back in ways more beautiful beyond Satan's imagining. So even the designs of the enemy are working ultimately to the good of God. And we can go right back to pagan literature, and that's the whole point of Oedipus Rex. That basically, that when wicked people try to pervert the will of the gods, in this case, by removing the person Oedipus, so he can't possibly kill his father, and he's raised by other people, then he, through a whole sequence of coincidences, he ends up being at exact spot at the exact time where he does actually kill his own father. So this whole idea that there's a providence that guides all things, and that whatever we do, and you carry on forever. I mean, this is Hamlet, the end of Hamlet, where Hamlet basically says, he quotes from the scripture about, there's not a sparrow that falls that God doesn't know about. That basically, if that everything's in the hands of divine providence, and when Hamlet accepts that and embraces his role as an agent of providence, laying down his life for his country so that something rotten in Denmark can be exorcised and justice be restored, that's because he comes eventually to understand what the will of God is, and he becomes an agent of God's providence. So it's the same sort of thing again in The Horse and His Boy, is that everything is ultimately within Aslan's providential design, and that doesn't become evident, of course, until the end of the book.
Yeah. Do you like the trope of sort of secret royalty, of someone not knowing, that they're the heir of some kingdom? Because that's very much a prominent sort of archetype in not just this story, but also in Lord of the Rings and that sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, in the king coming into his own, the exiled king, or the king that doesn't know that he's a king. I mean, this we have in so Tolkien's steeped, of course, in medieval literature, and Tolkien's a Catholic, so he would know the whole Arthurian legends about Arthur being the once and future king, who's just, he's asleep, he's not dead. The Jacobite kings who were forced into exile from the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the true kings of England, are forced into exile, and then we have these two Jacobite uprisings to try to restore the king, and this sort of toasting romantically the king over the water, right? The king who's in exile. So that Shasta is the king in exile, and the further part of mystery is he doesn't know that he's the king in exile, but that's who he is. And of course, in many ways, in some ways at least, all of us are that, right? I mean, we're all made in the image of God. We are all designed for heaven, and we can only fail to get there because we choose to screw it up. So it's the same sort of thing about what it ultimately is homecoming. So this is obviously a major trope in The Horseman's Boy. Ultimately, the homecoming is getting to heaven. That there is no true home uh, in this vale of tears, in this land of exile, right? Our true home is in heaven. So again, that Shasta's homecoming, coming into his own, is in some sense a metaphor for our own journeys. He's fatherless, he's trapped, he's friendless, and it's through a relationship, first of all, with neighbors, right? With Bree, with Quinn, with Aravis, but also, of course, with God, with Aslan, that he actually makes the journey and unwittingly at first returns home.
Now, Aravis is a really interesting character because she is a member of the Calormen. She is a daughter of a noble family, and she is resistant to this culture, this godless culture. Uh, and I think some people might see that as, in some sense, rebellious, and obviously it's very good in this situation, but I guess some people might confuse this kind of rebellious against this godless culture versus rebellious versus God. How do those different, or how do they differentiate, I guess?
Well, I think the first thing you need to realize is, of course, that the god, in inverted commas, of Calaman is Tash, and basically they're worshipping a false god, a heartless god, a god who demands. Well, basically a god. When there's two types of god, because there's the god who sacrifices himself for his creatures, the Christian God, and there's the God that demands that his creatures sacrifice themselves to him. Now, of course, love requires the sacrifice of oneself, whether it's the God sacrificing himself, the love of God being the sacrifice of Christ, or whether it's we becoming Christ-like in learning to love, in sacrificing ourselves. But the God of Calaman is not that sort of God. The God of Calaman is basically that you are nothing. All of you are slaves. I mean, and there are parallels, deliberate parallels with Islam. Again, if you understand, and this is controversial, I know, but if you understand the history of Christendom, the history of Europe, that Europe is in the north and the west, and then following the rise of Islam, then the Islam is in the south, and particularly the desert lands of North Africa. And so the whole geography of the Horse and His Boy is that Archenland and Narnia is in the north across a great desert, and the other side of the great desert is where Calaman is. And their clothing is sort of Arabic. It's that sort of exotic. Occident versus Orient. East versus West. That's a large part of the imagination of Western Europe. So that Lewis is playing into this, right? Into this whole cauldron of stories that have been part of Western culture. So that Aravis is true to her lights in many ways, right? Is that there's a culture where Islam means submission, where basically Tash is a totalitarian god who demands absolute obedience. Everybody else is a slave, ultimately, of that one god, and it's all about therefore hierarchies of caste. Right, and she's a noble woman and very proud of the fact, or noble lady, very proud of the fact that doesn't want anybody else, that below her, to get out of their own place in the scheme of things, right? So that's why she looks down at Shasta, this peasant boy, and what have you at the beginning. So her journey ultimately is to learn to love, to learn to actually understand that you have to open your heart and your mind to others. You have to be willing to sacrifice yourself for others, and you have to see beyond fairly narrow distinctions such as class. So that's her journey. Really, is to learn to unlearn the culture of Tash and to learn the culture of Aslan.
Yeah, that seems very much something we're in the middle of trying to unlearn.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah. It's interesting. Also, in some sense, uh, this whole battle, this whole conflict in the story between Archenlanders and the Narnians and the Archenlanders versus the Calormen sort of seem to be almost preventing the Crusades. Like the Crusades don't have to happen in this sort of history, or in this world, because Islam doesn't, or it's sort of the Islam-ish, not really Islam, but this antithetical group to sort of the followers of Aslan uh, don't aren't able to invade, unlike their ability to do so in in the Balkans, in Spain, that sort of thing, and up to France, it until the Battle of Tours. Is that sort of
Yeah, I mentioned the fact that there are clearly typological allusions to Islam, but we shouldn't
sure?
overstate the case, right? So that's the first thing. Clearly, Tash is not the Muslim god. Tash is quite clearly demonic. I don't think that Lewis would claim that Muslims are worshipping the devil. So we certainly can't push things too far, but certainly in the Western imagination, there is the enemy to the south that's always threatened conquest, and we need to be, in the last battle, then that's actually happening, right? So it's not as if Calaman has been defeated once and for all at the conclusion of The Horse and His Boy. It means
Hmm.
that the threat has been abated, and for a time at least, peace is restored. But it's almost as if, that if you read the Narnia stories as a whole, there has to be an eternal vigilance on the part of the people of Narnia and Archenland to preserve and protect their culture from encroachments from enemy cultures that would basically destroy the culture of Narnia and Archenland. So this is this part of of enduring vigilance against worldly enemies, and again, that's part of the reality of life. There are people out there, both in other countries and in our own country, that are trying to destroy everything we understand by Christian culture. And if we cease to be vigilant, we get conquered as individuals and as cultures.
Yeah. In this story also, there is there's sort of cameos of the former main characters of the stories. Uh we have Edmund, we have Susan, we have Lucy, and we don't have Peter. Peter's off, I think, fighting giants at the moment, I think. So why does Lewis bring back those characters sort of for like a brief cameo?
Well, I think the most important reason is that The Horse and His Boy is part of the Chronicles of Narnia, and obviously the Pevensey family. This part of the story of what threads it together. So he's sort of stitching The Horse and His Boy into the landscape of the Chronicles by having these characters make their appearance, even though they, within this particular story, are somewhat peripheral.
Gotcha. Do, uh, so why do you think he didn't like tell the story from their perspective? Like, is that, was that a specific move by Lewis to uh I don't know, just give us a different perspective, or because usually when we see them, they are the main characters in some way.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why The Horse and His Boy is very different from the other Narnia stories. And the other thing about them, of course, is that there's no uh, connection at all with our world. In the other Narnia stories, the Narnia is connected to our world because characters from our world enter Narnia. In The Horse and His Boy, that doesn't happen, right? The whole thing takes place, in Calaman and Archenland, and there's no. So, in other words, it's all takes place in that world in a three-dimensional uh, geographical space. There's no moving from one world to another. So it is very different. And what his reason for doing that was, I couldn't say. I mean, there are 3 huge volumes of C.S. Lewis's letters, and I haven't read them all. Whether he says something in there, be interesting exercise. Actually, I don't think I'm going to have time, but to just because obviously they've got indexes. You can go to A Horse and His Boy, and of course, actually, volume 1 wouldn't have anything about it because he hadn't written them yet. So to see what he does say about why that particular book. But if I were to guess, and again, I would simply say that he had the idea for the story, and he wanted to make it part of the Chronicles of Narnia. So he threaded in a few Pevensey family members and set it geographically in Archenland on the edge and Calaman. But I think he had the idea of this story of talking horses. Because we know that Animal Land was his first invented fantasy world when he was a child, made up of talking beasts. So this idea that we see in Narnia goes right back to his childhood. And of course, Hwin reminds us in his name very much of Hwinnim, and they're the talking horses in Gulliver's Travels. And of course, Lewis is steeped in these classics of the past. So these are all the creative, should we say, creative seeds that he sort of are planted in Lewis's imagination, and he lets them out in this particular way in The Horse and His Boy. I think he just had this idea for the story, and he wanted to set it within the framework of Narnia, and that's the way that he did it. But it wasn't about Pevensey children. It was about particularly, the horse and his boy. If you want to take the actual the eponymous heroes of the title,
Yeah. Are you familiar with sort of the distinction or sort of between like high fantasy or fantasy and like fairy tale stories? Like
well, I mean, again, I might familiar with the distinction. That various people make various different distinctions, so I'm not really sure, what you said. For instance, I mean, Tolkien, in his essay lecture on fairy stories, makes a distinction between fairy, which is high fantasy, and the sort of fairy tales that have fairies as diminutive creatures with wings on their backs, a cross between the human being and a dragonfly, that you can see finding sitting on flowers. I mean, that for him would be low brow, somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for here, uncouth, brutal, banal, as opposed to the high art of there's a huge difference between that sort of diminutive fairy, Tinkerbell in Walt Disney, for instance,
Sure.
and an elf who's actually technically etymologically also a fairy, right? But you won't put Tinkerbell beside Legolas. So that would be a perfect example of high fantasy versus this sort of lowbrow fairy stories.
Yeah, it's just I've heard people distinguish between Narnia and Lord of the Rings as sort of like sort of or basically a fantasy that goes into our world and affects our world, and then there's fantasy that is just its own world kind of thing. Is at least I've heard that.
Well, I mean, again, if Tolkien and Lewis, I suspect, would answer that in the following way: that the thing they would say is there is applicability, and that the Lord of the Rings does impact our world, not within the story, but the story impacts our world, because when we read it, we see our world very differently, and it changes us greatly, or at least it's meant to and should. So our world is changed, but our world has been changed greatly by the fact that Tolkien wrote the Lord of the Rings. But of course, it's true that no one's going across time and space in the Lord of the Rings. But then Tolkien would also say that Middle Earth is our world. So it's our world in the past. So it's not even a different world anyway, except in so far as time changes everything. So it's obviously different because time has changed things. But in terms of space, it's our planet, not Narnia, which is clearly somewhere entirely different. So I don't see that as high or low. I just think that they are different narrative techniques. I don't know if I'd place them hierarchically on the basis of that definition, one above the other.
Yeah, I've never had really an opinion on it. It's just an interesting thing that I've come across people talking about. What do you think about Aslan's punishment of Rapidash at the end?
Well, I think it's brilliant because all he does is to outwardly manifest what Rapidash already is. That Rapidash is an ass already. All right, he is blinded by his own pride from being able to see the truth, even when the truth is staring him in the face. In other words, his own arrogance leads to an ignorance that prevents him from seeing reality. So ultimately, he's warned. He ignores the warning because of his pompous inability to perceive reality. And again, we want to get deep here. That Thomas Aquinas insists that the only way the path to reality begins with humility. So, in the Summa, the humility leads to a sense of gratitude. Gratitude opens the eyes in wonder. Wonder leads to contemplation, and contemplation leads to the dilatatio, the dilation of the mind and soul into the fullness of reality. So, without humility, and the definition of pride is the absence of humility, right? So without humility, with pride, you don't have a sense of gratitude. So there is no sense of gratitude with Rapidash, right? He has no sense of gratitude towards anybody. He's completely self-serving. Therefore, he has no sense of wonder. So he refuses to see the wonder in front of him. He certainly has no ability to be moved to any sort of contemplation of a deeper reality. He's an ass. And so basically, when he refuses to learn, even though he's given the opportunity, he's not punished until he has the opportunity to see that he's an ass and to repent. He doesn't repent of the fact he's an ass, so he becomes one.
Yeah. It
Well, I mean, he is already one. He's outwardly manifested what he already is.
yeah, it's interesting to see the kings and queens offer him this, this chance of repentance, this chance to they don't really want to punish him. It's
No, exactly. It's exactly. I mean, uh, a correct understanding the Merchant of Venice is that Portia, in disguise as the lawyer in the trial of Shylock, is doing everything she can to prevent Shylock from walking into the trap that he set for himself. No law will allow you to murder someone because they owe you money. So if he's going to insist on pursuing his bond, which will result in the killing of Antonio, he is going to be punished. So all of Portia's trying to do in that trial scene is to get him to see that and to not walk into the trap he set for himself, and he refuses in his own pride and arrogance and faces the consequences. So, there's a beauty to it that basically that you're not just being punished at random or an eye for an eye. Well, you've done this, we're now going to do this, right? On the contrary, now you've done this, but we're quite willing to forgive you. We just want you to acknowledge and to change your ways, and to make some promises, and all's going to be fine. And then the person refuses to do so, and that's when the punishment kicks in. So it's
so
self-inflicted.
strange.
It's not an eye for an eye, right? It's not an eye for
Hmm.
an eye. It's self-inflicted. That they're basically, effectively, to stick with the metaphor, Rapidash plucks his own eye out.
Yeah, definitely. There's a really strange character in the Horse and His Boy, and that's the Hermit. What do you make of the Hermit? What?
That's a very good question. Obviously, he serves a function of bringing an element of holiness in without Lewis having to be overtly religious in a Christian sense, because that would be out of place in the context of the story to be preaching. But if you bring a character in who quite clearly is living an ascetically holy life, that's going to remind his readers of Christian hermits and Christian monks, then that allows you to bring that element in without reducing your story to just preachiness, which would destroy it as a work of art. And again, I keep bringing it into textual references here because they come to me, and all the great works of literature, and the Chronicles of Narnia are great works of literature, are in conversation with other great works of literature. They're part of a living heritage. So the Shakespeare does the same thing. He's living in a culture where the Catholic Church is illegal. So if he wants to bring Catholicism into his stories, he sets them in a place like Italy, where you can certainly have Franciscan friars walking around, because that's what happens in Italy. So you find ways of bringing the religious element in without violating the culture in which you find yourself. So as Lewis and Tolkien have said, if you want to you can smuggle no end of theology under cover of romance because of the ignorance of the modern culture. But they also said you have to get past those watchful dragons. In other words, the secular culture are like watchful dragons that are keeping an eye out for any trace of Christianity in culture in general, in literature in particular. And if you want to actually have a Christian literature, you have to, in our day and age, get past those watchful dragons. So that's an example of how he does it. He has a hermit. He doesn't have a Christian monk. That would be out of place because it's not in a Christian world. Well, no, I'm going to clarify that it is a Christian world, because Aslan is the son of God. So it's the same God as our world, but he sets it somewhere where God has not manifested himself is incarnating himself as Jesus Christ. So therefore, he has to manifest it in certain ways. So introducing a hermit would be a way of doing that. But it's a good question. I hadn't actually thought about it at any length, any depth, until you forced me to.
Well, that's my job. That my job is to force you to think about things that you might not have. It's interesting that he sort of gives them a sort of window into sort of the battle, because they get to sort of see, like, there's like is it a pool or some sort of ability for them to watch what's going on in the battle between the Narnians, the Archenlanders, and the Calormen. And I feel like or I think it reminds me, at least, of sort of how monks, cloistered monks and nuns pray for pray so that pray for the outside world while not being really a part of the outside world. And in some ways, that's how they influence. Um, you know, their prayers are effective. In some ways, that kind of reminds me of that. I don't know if that
No,
makes sense.
I think that's very perceptive, and I think it's very true. And you certainly, the fact that the hermit has some sort of ability to be a seer, right? Not just a wise man, but one who has the ability to see things because of a spiritual perception that's uncommon, accentuates the hermit's role, if you like, as a monastic type cloistered individual in the sense that you're talking about. And of course, the power of prayer is something that Lewis and Tolkien both believed in. So this person, although he's living apart from the world, has nonetheless a huge influence upon the world.
Yeah. The centaurs also have sort of a seer ability, sort of a very priestly, prophetic uh sort of status in the world of Narnia. I believe it's the centaurs who make the prophecy comes about saving of Archenland. Do you see that as sort of a priestly role as well?
Yeah, and again, it's similar in the last battle, right? Is that you have this uh, they the centaurs appear to be priestly, prophetic, being able to see and understand spiritual realities, and including perhaps a prophetic understanding of the future in a way that transcends and supersedes the abilities of others. So absolutely, I'm not really sure why, in terms of the classical centaurs, within the context of the horse and his boy, of course, that they are a combination of both, talking horse and man. So, but I don't know why he why centaurs in particular are selected to have that particular power. But you're completely correct that they do have that, as far as I can see, they do have that function, that purpose, and that role in the stories.
Yeah. It seems like maybe just because horses are extraordinarily noble, and then you add, sort of the man function as well. To me, that might be the reason. But yeah, it's just interesting, these different pieces of the world that remind us of sort of Christian religion in that way. And you were also talking about earlier how, the dragons are watching for anything Christian sort of to pop up in stories. Even I kind of feel like that sometimes. I like, and when I'm reading a story, sometimes I think, wait, is does this seem out of place? Like, is this outside of what we should be expecting from a story like this? It's almost like I don't know if I'm trying to determine whether or not something is like authentic, kind of like how like there are really bad Christian movies that are just like preachy and hitting you over the head with some message. Sometimes I think we're trying, at least as Christians, trying to determine whether it's out of place or whether or not like and preachy, or whether or not um I don't know, it fits properly. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In this sense, that watchful dragons can be good critics. If it's a Christian dragon, if we can mix our metaphors in that way. For instance, I won't give the name of the novel, but there was a very, very good Christian novel published in the last 10 years or so, and it was excellent. But to me, it was completely spoiled because there were 2 or 3 pages stuck in the middle of it of absolute preaching that had nothing to do with the development of the plot. It was completely unnecessary. You could just excise, and nothing would be lost. And it just meant that the whole thing, all of a sudden, the author stops telling us a story and looks directly at us and preaches at us. Well, that destroys the work as a work of art. That actually, that particular story is fixable because you could just remove that and it would actually be
Yeah,
good.
the author
But
can just do that quickly.
if an author keeps doing it, I mean, it ruins art. The story itself has a nobility and ability and an ability to lead us to the truth. That uh, Christ teaches it in parables, right? He in some of the gospel, he explains the parables to his disciples, but in others he doesn't. I mean, the prodigal son, there's no preaching at the end of it. The father just celebrates because the son's returned. The brothers envious and angry, and it's a story. And we get the point of the story without Christ having to say, well, the prodigal son is you, and the father is me. He doesn't need to say that, right? Because the story itself conveys the message in a non-preachy way. The narrative does the job in itself.
Yeah, Christ, the greatest storyteller.
Amen. And
Yeah.
he's the one to sanctify story. So when people tell me that they only want to read non-fiction, I say, well, you're not doing what Christ does then.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, we have an imagination for a purpose. We should use it.
Amen.
Um, yep.
Amen.
So, Joseph, thank you for coming on, talking about the horse and his boy. It's wonderful talking to you always. Anything you want to plug before we go?
Well, no, I would ask people to check out my personal website. That's jpearce.co, jpearce.co. That post new things several times a week, and I post to the inner sanctum of the website, to the members area, 3 new podcasts and an essay every week. So, and there's a 45 part course on Tolkien and Lewis also there. So if you want to go further up and further in, if this conversation has whetted your appetite, then check out my website.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that your work is so awesome, and a great inspiration for me. And Thank you for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you for this podcast, and thank you for having me on. It's always a joy to talk with you. You're knowledgeable, you love the same things I do, and you're eloquent. So that put those three things together, and always have an enjoyable time with you. So thanks very much, Connor, for the invitation.
Thank you. Please, everyone, like, share, comment, and subscribe. Go to Joseph Pearce's website and have a great day. God bless.